They used to joke that in communist Europe, there was one country where you could both buy Western jeans on the black market and spend your summer on the Adriatic without needing Moscow's permission. It was called Yugoslavia, and for people behind the Iron Curtain, it looked less like another gray satellite and more like a side door left ajar. On the maps hanging in party offices in Warsaw, East Berlin, or Bucharest, Yugoslavia was colored red, same as the Soviet Union and the rest of the socialist camp. But once you got close, the differences were impossible to ignore. Yugoslavs could travel abroad more easily. Western tourists poured into their beaches. Their passports opened doors in both East and West. And if you were desperate enough to escape your own regime, there was a rumor that circulated in factory locker rooms and student dormitories from Budapest to Bucharest. If you can just make it into Tito's Yugoslavia, Italy and the free world are only a few kilometers away. That rumor was not just wishful thinking. From the mid-1950s to the late 1970s, Yugoslavia really did function as a kind of pressure valve on the Iron Curtain. It was socialist, but not bound by the Warsaw Pact. It hosted millions of tourists from the West, exported hundreds of thousands of its own citizens as guest workers to West Germany and Austria, and quietly acted as a country of first asylum for tens of thousands of people fleeing harsher communist regimes. For Eastern Bloc fugitives who made it there, the route forward ran through a rugged strip of border into Italy, and from there into a world that, when they finally saw it up close, made a mockery of everything their propaganda had told them about capitalism's decay. To understand why Yugoslavia was different, you have to go back to 1948. That year, Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito broke with Stalin. Refusing to turn his country into a mere Soviet satellite, he was expelled from the Cominform and subjected to intense pressure from Moscow. But instead of capitulating, Tito steered Yugoslavia onto its own path, still socialist and one party, but independent in foreign policy. In the 1950s and 1960s, Belgrade became a founding pillar of the non-aligned movement, keeping good relations with Washington in Western Europe, even as it professed loyalty to socialism at home. That status gave Yugoslavia options no other communist state had. Western governments, eager to exploit the split in the socialist camp, offered credits, trade deals, and political support. Tourists from Italy, Austria, West Germany, Britain, and beyond began pouring into coastal resorts on the Adriatic. At the same time, Yugoslavia's leaders realized something basic. They needed hard currency, and one way to get it was to open the country's doors. By the early 1960s, Yugoslavia had embarked on what historians now call an open-door policy. Unlike the Soviet Union or its loyal satellites, it did not treat tourism as a dangerous privilege to be tightly rationed. It treated it as an industry. In 1962, it welcomed around 1.1 million foreign tourists. 3 years later, that number climbed past 2.1 million, making Yugoslavia the most visited socialist country in the world by Westerners. In 1967, Belgrade took an even more radical step. It became the first communist state to abolish tourist visa requirements altogether, aligning its practices with those of Western European destinations. At the same time, Yugoslav citizens enjoyed a freedom of movement that seemed almost fantastical to their neighbors. Thanks to its non-aligned status, a Yugoslav passport opened doors in both East and West. Unlike Poles or East Germans, who often waited years and underwent heavy vetting for a single foreign trip, Yugoslavs could travel relatively easily to Italy, Austria, West Germany, and further afield. Tens of thousands took advantage of this to find work abroad as Gastarbeiter, guest workers in West German factories, Austrian construction sites, and Swiss hotels. By 1970, more than 400,000 Yugoslavs were legally employed in West Germany alone. Even in 1982, after some return migration, there were still around 367,000. Their presence normalized the idea inside Yugoslavia that going west for a better life was not treason, but a kind of extended commute. Plenty came back, plenty did not. But for citizens of other socialist states looking in from the outside, the picture was clear. Tito's country was a place where crossing the line into the capitalist world was more routine, less suicidal than anywhere else behind the nominal Iron Curtain. That impression hardened into fact during the first great refugee crisis of the Cold War, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. When Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest in November to crush the uprising, an estimated 200,000 Hungarians fled their homeland in a matter of weeks. The vast majority, around 180,000, poured into Austria, but about 20,000 crossed south into Yugoslavia. Beleg could have responded the way East European regimes usually did, with arrests, deportations, or sealed borders. Instead, it did something remarkable. It offered asylum. A 1958 report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees notes that Yugoslavia granted asylum to about 20,000 Hungarian refugees, motivated solely by humanitarian considerations, even though this placed a heavy financial burden on a country still rebuilding from war. To care for them, the Yugoslav government had to take out a short-term loan, and by the end of 1957, it estimated it had spent about $7 million on the refugees, much of it not yet reimbursed. At the UN, diplomats formally recognized Yugoslavia and Austria as countries of first asylum for the Hungarians, and urged other states to help by accepting them for resettlement. Over the next few years, those refugees fanned out across the Western world: Canada, the United States, Australia, Britain, and beyond. In many cases, their path ran through Italian ports and camps, reached from Yugoslavia by train, truck, or boat. That crisis set a precedent. It showed that Yugoslavia could and would play a double game, maintaining a socialist system at home while serving, in practice, as a humanitarian buffer between the hard dictatorships of Eastern Europe and the democracies of the West. It also established a basic geography of escape that would be repeated in various forms for decades. Flee your own regime into Yugoslavia, then continue westward until you reach Italian soil. But the traffic did not only flow into Yugoslavia, it also flowed out. From the mid-1950s onward, Yugoslavia itself produced a steady stream of people who treated the Italian border not as a line never to be crossed, but a door to be opened. A detailed study titled Heading Towards the West, Yugoslav Asylum Seekers in Italy, 1955 to 1968, gives us hard numbers. On average, about 4,500 Yugoslav citizens crossed into Italy during that period. In 1957, the number spiked dramatically to 11,040, driven partly by the aftershocks of the Hungarian crisis and partly by a recent relaxation of Yugoslav border controls, which made crossing easier. These figures include both legal and illegal crossings. In the 1950s, many Yugoslavs attempted to leave clandestinely, slipping across the land border in forests and hills, or taking to the Adriatic Sea in small fishing boats and skiffs bound for Italian shores. Local party records from places like Zarda on the Dalmatian coast tell a story of alarmed officials. In 1956, Communist Party reports in that city counted around 150 people arrested for trying to cross the border illegally and estimated another 300 ready to attempt it. Across in the Slovenian port region of Koper, internal documents from around 1963 spoke of 10 to 20 people per day being picked up by the People's Militia and the army for illegal attempts to leave or re-enter. The sea routes were especially dangerous. The stretch of Adriatic between Yugoslav coast and Italy could look deceptively calm on summer days, but small, overloaded boats, bad weather, and nighttime departures took their toll. Historians note that over time, as Yugoslavia's legal travel regime liberalized, fewer people risked these clandestine crossings and more chose a different path. They obtained valid passports, traveled legally to Italy, and simply did not come back. The shift is visible in the numbers. In 1958, about 13.6% of Yugoslavs who entered Italy did so with legal documents and then overstayed. By 1963, that proportion had risen to 36.7%. The border had not disappeared, but it had changed character. Where East Germans still risked mines and machine guns at the Berlin Wall, a Yugoslav from certain regions could just board a bus or train, show a pass or passport, step into Trieste, and then quietly fade into the West. Those certain regions mattered. The border between Yugoslavia and Italy was not uniform. In the province of Trieste and the surrounding areas of Friuli and the Slovene-Croatian littoral, special agreements recognized the reality of intertwined communities. The 1955 Udine Agreement, for instance, allowed residents of 12 Yugoslav frontier municipalities, 9 in Slovenia, 3 in Croatia, to cross into Italy up to 4 times a month using local border passes instead of full passports. These included places like Nova Gorica, Sežana, Koper, Isola, and Piran on the Yugoslav side, directly facing Italian towns and ports. Officially, the system was meant to ease cross-border commerce and family visits in areas where Italian, Slovene, and Croatian communities had long overlapped. In practice, it created precisely the kind of micro-corridors fugitives dream about. If you lived in one of those municipalities or could get yourself registered there, you had a legal way to go into Italy several times a month. All you had to do at some point was not use your right to come back. On the Italian side of that line, the key destination was almost always the same: Trieste. Perched on a narrow strip of coastline between the Karst Plateau and the Adriatic, Trieste had been at the crossroads of empires for centuries. After World War II, it became something more, a pressure point between East and West, and a magnet for refugees of all kinds. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the city and its hinterland had seen the Istrian-Dalmatian exodus, as around 300,000 to 350,000 ethnic Italians fled territories awarded to Yugoslavia, moving westward into Italy. Many passed through refugee camps and reception centers around Trieste and Genoa. By the late 1950s and 1960s, those same facilities, or their successors, were housing a different mix of people. An article on Trieste's Patriciano camp describes it as the largest refugee camp in the area, a silent witness of the tragic past, noting that at various points between the 1950s and 1970s, it held between 5,000 and 7,000 people at a time. One local museum site notes that by 1961, roughly one-third of Trieste's population consisted of refugees of one kind or another. In those barracks, Nissen huts, and repurposed buildings, you might find side by side Italian exiles from Istria, Yugoslav dissidents, Albanian escapees, Hungarian revolutionaries, and increasingly people from all across the Eastern Bloc who had threaded their way through Yugoslavia to reach Italian soil. An international agency like the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, ICEM, and the UNHCR ran processing and resettlement programs. From Trieste, chartered ships and planes carried accepted refugees to Canada, the United States, Australia, and Latin America. One memoirist described how in the late 1950s, his family's journey from a communist country took them first through Yugoslavia, then to a camp near Trieste, then finally on to a ship bound for New York. The pattern became so established that one historian writing about Yugoslav asylum seekers flatly states, Italy served as a primary transit country for Yugoslav refugees before their migration to overseas destinations. Yugoslavia's role expanded beyond its own citizens. As the decades went on, it also became a first shelter for people fleeing some of the harshest regimes in the socialist world, especially Enver Hoxha's Albania, but also Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania, and at times even East Germany. Having ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention, Yugoslavia officially committed itself to offering protection to those fleeing persecution. Still, that commitment was uneven and deeply entangled with politics. Still, one academic study notes that Yugoslavia functioned explicitly as a country of first asylum for refugees from Eastern Europe, mainly Albanians, whose next destination before leaving Europe was Italy. A declassified CIA report on Yugoslav treatment of Romanian refugees from the early 1950s gives a sense of how this worked on the ground. Romanian escapees who crossed the Danube into Yugoslavia were picked up by the UDDA, the Yugoslav secret police, and sent to camps like Zrenjanin and later Garivo. There, they were screened for security risks and political usefulness. Those deemed assets might be courted by Western intelligence services or Yugoslav agencies. Those seen as liabilities sometimes found themselves held for months under Spartan conditions. Yet, compared to being immediately handed back to the Securitate in Bucharest, even that limbo could feel like a reprieve. Remarkably, by the 1970s, Yugoslavia was even being paid not to send such people back. An investigative piece on Romanian escape routes notes that from 1972, the East German government began paying both Romania and Yugoslavia for the return of captured East German escapees, who could then be sold on in a later step to West Germany as a part of a separate human ransom program. At the same time, the UN and Western organizations were paying significant sums not to extradite citizens of other communist states, on the order of $25 to $30 per refugee per night, to house them in camps while resettlement was arranged. It was a strange economy of escape. On one side, hardline regimes like East Germany and Romania tried to plug every leak in their systems, even striking deals to recover and monetize their own runaways. On the other, Yugoslavia and Italy found themselves hosting a growing population of people whose main crime was wanting out, and who were in some cases literally being subsidized by half the world to stay out. For those individuals, the route through Yugoslavia was never just an arrow on a map. It was a series of hard decisions and vivid contrasts. Imagine an East German couple in the late 1960s. The Berlin Wall has gone up. Trying to climb it means almost certain death or years in prison. But there are whispers at church and in trusted kitchens about another way, a southern path. If you can get to Romania on a legal trip, there might be a chance to slip across its western border into Yugoslavia. From there, Italy is within reach. Stasi files declassified after 1990 show how seriously East Berlin took this threat. Internal reports complain that citizens of the GDR, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, and even some Soviets were trying to use the Romania-Yugoslavia route to reach the West. According to one summary, for every East German who headed to Yugoslavia via Romania, 8 tried via Bulgaria and 10 via Hungary. But the mere fact that the Yugoslav option exists in these memos proves it was on people's minds. If our hypothetical couple makes it onto a train heading southwest, they trade one world for another almost without noticing. The blocky gray of East Bloc railway stations gives way to the more varied landscape of Yugoslav towns. Billboards do not praise the latest 5-year plan. They advertise Adriatic hotels, Western soft drinks, and consumer goods. Western tourists share compartments on the line to the coast, chatting in German, Italian, and English. Their cameras and clothing are unmistakably different from the drab standard back home. Crossing into Italy, whether at a small border post in Friuli or by stepping off a Yugoslav bus into the bustle of Trieste, they encounter something they have only seen in smuggled magazines or carefully framed newsreels. There are private cars everywhere. Not just for party bosses. Shop windows are full, even in winter, with televisions, refrigerators, radios, and fashionable clothes. Gas stations are lit at night like islands of brightness. Neon signs hang over streets that do not go dark after 10 o'clock. In Trieste itself, the contrasts pile up. On one side of the bay, Soviet-built freighters and Yugoslav ferries tie up alongside Italian and Western European ships. On the other, cruise liners and container vessels built in German and Italian yards tower over the docks. Inside the refugee camp at Padriciano, they sleep in cramped dormitories, line up for food, and wait for interviews with officials from ICEM or the UNHCR. Outside the gates, they see something that might even sting more than the paperwork. Ordinary Italians going about their day with a level of prosperity and access to technology that their old governments had insisted was an illusion. For someone who has been told for years that capitalism means unemployment, hunger, and collapse, it is hard to reconcile those slogans with the supermarket aisles of Trieste, the crowded tram lines of Milan, or the rows of Fiat and Volkswagen cars parked along the streets. Just as Polish refugees in Canada or Soviet pilots in Japan marveled at Western abundance, these fugitives from behind the Iron Curtain experienced their own quiet shock on the shores of the Adriatic. From an American perspective, these Yugoslav roots add a dimension to the Cold War story that is easy to miss. The United States does not feature as prominently on the first leg of the journey. There are no GIs at the border, no American tanks breaking down fences, but the system that waits at the far end, the one that resettles Hungarian revolutionaries in Chicago, places Yugoslav dissidents in Canadian factories, or flies Romanian escapees to Los Angeles, is deeply American in its organization and its technological underpinnings. In New York or Toronto or Melbourne, the same pattern we have seen with Polish Solidarity refugees or Soviet defectors in Asia plays out again. People who risked their lives crossing forests, rivers, and seas just to reach a Western foothold via Yugoslavia now find themselves in sprawling, electrified cities built on mass production, private enterprise, and information flows orders of magnitude more open than anything they left behind. They walk through airports run by computerized reservation systems, ride in cars with reliable heating and radios, and find that even working-class neighborhoods have refrigerators, televisions, and telephones as standard fixtures. In that sense, the escape through Yugoslavia is more than a Balkan curiosity. It is another front where the realities of Western technology and prosperity slowly, relentlessly undermined the ideological claims of the Soviet bloc. A Yugoslav laborer who goes to West Germany as a guest worker and returns home with a television and a Volkswagen is a walking contradiction to the official newspaper that says capitalism breeds only misery. A Romanian refugee who travels from a Yugoslav camp through Trieste to a resettlement center in Canada will sooner or later write letters home or send back photographs that say more than any radio-free Europe ever could. For Americans watching these stories decades later, there is something satisfying in tracing those lines on the map. East Germans and Romanians slipping through Romania into Yugoslavia, Albanians and Hungarians crossing into Tito's state because it is less likely to shoot them on sight. Lines of people at border posts near Nova Gorica or Koper, some with local passes, others trembling with fake documents, all looking toward a horizon where the next stop is Italy. On the other side of that horizon lies a world where the biggest question is not whether you are allowed to travel, but which airline has the best fare. Not whether your government will let you own a radio, but which model and how many channels it can receive. Yugoslavia was no paradise. It had its own secret police, its own political prisoners, its own economic crises. But in the strange geometry of the Cold War, it became a pivot point, a socialist country that through its openness and its unique position between blocs, accidentally helped thousands of people step out of the Soviet orbit and into the American one. Every time someone walked from a Yugoslav border village into Trieste or from a camp near Padriciano onto a ship for New York, a small piece of the Iron Curtain shifted south and thinned. And every time they looked back, whether from an Italian hillside, a Canadian suburb, or an American freeway, they knew, with a clarity that no speech could match, that the world they had entered was not the one they had been warned about. It was brighter, faster, more wired, and more full of choices than anything the planners in Moscow or Bucharest had been able to build. In the end, the road out through Yugoslavia did not just carry people west, it carried their stories and their comparisons back east, helping to erode one human journey at a time the foundations of a system that could not keep up.